The final day of Lucky Luciano's life did not begin like the ending of a legend. It began quietly, almost like any other morning in Naples. The winter air carried the salty breath of the harbor, and the sunlight stretched across the cobblestone streets in thin, pale lines. Old men played cards near the cafes. Children shouted at one another, tossing stones at stray dogs. No one realized that a man who once commanded the most feared criminal empire in America was walking among them, carrying a secret he had protected for more than half a century. He looked older than his reputation suggested. His hair had thinned, his steps had slowed, and his face carried the lines of a man who survived too many wars fought in alleyways, nightclubs, backrooms, prison cells, and smoke-filled hotels where deals determined life or death. But even in these final hours, he held something in his eyes that had never left him: calculation, awareness, the constant scanning of the room, as if expecting a ghost from his past to step out of the shadows. For decades, Lucky Luciano had been a myth as much as a man. Newspapers called him the architect of the American Mafia. Politicians painted him as a demon who corrupted a generation. Other gangsters whispered his name with a mix of fear and respect, as if death itself would hesitate before approaching him. Yet none of them knew the full story, because Luciano never allowed anyone close enough to understand him completely. Throughout his life he played every side, trusted no one fully, and buried truths so deep that even his closest allies sensed there was always more he wasn't saying. On this final day, all of it, the violence, the power, the betrayals, the nights of champagne and bloodshed, seemed to follow him like silent spectators. He had lived through the brutal Prohibition wars, outsmarted the most dangerous men on the East Coast, survived kidnappings, police raids, assassination attempts, and the collapse of entire crime families. He had outlived nearly everyone who once stood beside him. Meyer Lansky was still alive, yes, but far away. Frank Costello was a relic in New York. Vito Genovese, his greatest rival, had died in prison. The mafia he once built had transformed into something colder, greedier, and more chaotic than even he intended. But there was something else, something no one could name. Those who met him during his exile in Italy described a strange tension around him, a sense that he carried a burden that time could not wash away. He was a man who had seen too much, known too much, and chosen silence where others would seek confession. As Luciano stepped into the lobby of the Hotel Excelsior to meet a film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life, he stood at the edge of a crossroads he had managed to avoid for 64 years. He always controlled the story. He always held the power. But this meeting would force him to revisit the darkest corners of his past, places he had sealed shut behind unbreakable mental walls. People believed he agreed to the meeting because he wanted to shape his legacy. But for Luciano it was something deeper, something more dangerous. Because telling the story risked exposing the one thing he had never revealed, the one truth he protected more fiercely than his empire. Witnesses later said he seemed both eager and uneasy, as though he knew that speaking too freely could open doors that were better left closed. He reached into his pocket for a cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. Some thought it was age. Others thought it was excitement. But no one realized it was fear, not the kind of fear a gangster feels when he's about to be shot, but the quieter, colder fear of knowing that a secret might finally slip from his grasp. They say death is silent, but Luciano's arrived with shocking speed. One moment he was speaking animatedly, gesturing with the confidence of a man reliving his glory days. The next, his words cut short. His hand gripped his chest. His body staggered. And suddenly, he was collapsing to the marble floor as horrified onlookers rushed toward him. There was no last confession. No whispered name. No cinematic revelation. His eyes remained open, but whatever passed through them was unreadable, an expression frozen between pain and something that looked almost like relief. As if the burden he carried was finally slipping away, untouchable, unspoken, and destined to die with him. Authorities found nothing unusual in his pockets. No letters. No documents. No clues. Just a man whose life had been an empire of shadows, and whose death left behind a silence far more powerful than any truth he could have spoken. For decades, historians, detectives, mobsters, and conspiracy theorists have debated what exactly Lucky Luciano took to the grave. Was it the name of a traitor? Political deal? A murder he orchestrated but never admitted? Or was it something so explosive it could have reshaped everything we know about organized crime? Whatever it was, he guarded it with absolute devotion. Through trials, exile, imprisonment, and betrayal, he never surrendered it. And as his body was taken away that cold January afternoon, the world realized that the most dangerous man in Mafia history had pulled off one final act of mastery, dying with the truth still locked behind his eyes. Before Lucky Luciano rose to power, the American underworld was a chaotic battlefield, loud, messy, impulsive, and dangerously unpredictable. There were gangs on every corner, each one ruled by a man who believed fear alone was enough to sustain an empire. New York City in the early 1900s was a patchwork of ethnic enclaves, each with its own bosses, rivalries, and codes of survival. Italians, Jews, Irish, Germans, every community had its own criminal networks, each trying to carve out space in a city that was bursting with opportunity and desperation. The Mafia existed, yes, but not as an organized machine. It was more like several feuding tribes, old-world traditions colliding with new-world ambitions. At the heart of this disorder were the so-called mustache Petes, the old-school Sicilian gangsters who clung to medieval codes and village-style leadership. They brought with them the traditions of the old country, loyalty to blood, respect to age, and an iron belief in hierarchy. To them, America was simply a larger stage on which to recreate the world they had left behind. They were cautious, slow to adapt, and suspicious of anyone who didn't share their dialect or birthplace. They refused to trust American-born Italians. They rejected innovation. They feared change. And they treated young street kids like Lucky Luciano as mere foot soldiers, useful but never worthy of true power. Across the city, crime was fragmented. Little Italy was controlled by its own families, East Harlem by others, Brooklyn by dozens of factions constantly colliding. The Irish dominated the docks and Tammany Hall. Jewish gangsters ran some of the most profitable rackets but were often targeted by Italian traditionalists. Everyone fought for territory but few understood strategy. It was a world driven by ego rather than vision, by personal vendettas rather than grand design. Murders erupted over insults, spilled drinks, or perceived slights. Alliances shifted day by day. No one trusted anyone for long. And while the criminals were busy fighting over scraps, America itself was changing. Immigration was reshaping the country's identity. Cities were swelling with millions of newcomers searching for survival. The law struggled to keep up. Police were underpaid, often corrupt, and deeply influenced by political machines that relied on criminal alliances to maintain control. The stage was set for a new kind of underworld, one that understood the potential of this rapidly growing nation, one that saw beyond the neighborhood and imagined something much greater. But that vision did not yet exist. Instead, there was chaos. Prohibition had not yet begun, so alcohol flowed freely. Bars, brothels, and gambling dens operated independently, each paying off its own set of cops, each answering to its own unofficial rulers. Violence was common, but profits were small. No one had figured out how to centralize crime, how to scale it, how to turn illegal activities into a massive business enterprise. The underworld lacked a blueprint. It lacked organization. Most importantly, it lacked a leader who could see the bigger picture. Into this environment stepped the first sparks of power that would later shape the Mafia's golden age. Men like Joe Masuria, Salvatore Maranzano, and others who sought to impose structure, but their methods were brutal, almost archaic. They killed more than they negotiated. They clung to old loyalties rather than new strategies. Their vision was limited by tradition, and their leadership was often built on paranoia. Under them, young gangsters like Luciano watched, learned, and, quietly, grew frustrated. There was another layer to this world. Corruption so pervasive it threaded through every institution. Judges could be bought. Police captains could be bribed. Politicians could be pressured. In such an environment, crime could flourish, but only if someone understood how to manipulate the system without drawing too much heat. Most gangsters lacked that finesse. They were too focused on immediate gains, too trapped in old codes, too blinded by pride. They didn't realize that the United States was becoming a nation of opportunity, not just for honest immigrants but for criminals who were smart enough to adapt. New York became a swirling storm of opportunity, violence, and ambition. It was a place where a single night could elevate a gangster or bury him forever. Money was everywhere but scattered. Power was available but unclaimed. The old guard was strong but rigid. The young generation was hungry but directionless. And the law was overwhelmed, leaking at every seam. This was the world Luciano walked into. A world begging for someone who could unify chaos into order. Someone who could break the old rules without losing the respect of the streets. Someone who could see that the future of crime wasn't in petty disputes or neighborhood wars, but in organization, efficiency, and innovation. Before Luciano, the Mafia was a ghost, half-formed, inconsistent, and uncertain. After him, it would become an empire. But that transformation required understanding the world as it was before his rise. Fractured, confused, and ready for a revolution that no one yet imagined. The old system was crumbling. The future was waiting. And Luciano was watching, absorbing, preparing for the moment when he would reshape everything the underworld thought it knew. He arrived in America as a boy, not a gangster. The journey alone was enough to harden anyone. The cramped steerage quarters of the SS Città di Milano were filled with sickness, fear, and the constant smell of sweat and desperation. Families clung to what little they owned. Children cried through the nights. Mothers whispered prayers they barely believed in anymore. When Salvatore Lucania stepped onto Ellis Island in 1906, he didn't step into opportunity. He stepped into a world that demanded survival above all else. New York City was overwhelming. Buildings taller than anything he had seen in Sicily. Streets crowded with vendors, beggars, factory workers, and hustlers. The air thick with smoke and noise. For immigrant children, especially Italian ones, life was brutal. You worked or you starved. You fought or you were crushed. And for young Salvatore, whose father labored long hours hauling cement while barely earning enough to feed the family, school was a luxury he didn't care for. He preferred the streets. The streets taught real lessons. At just 10 years old, he began to understand the dynamics of power through humiliation. The Irish boys controlled the blocks near the Lower East Side. They mocked Italian kids, stole their lunch money, beat them for sport. One afternoon, after being cornered and shoved around, he was forced to hand over the few pennies he had earned carrying groceries. The shame burned deeper than the bruises. That night he made a decision. He would never be powerless again. If the world respected strength, then he would become strong enough to command it. He started offering protection, small scale at first. For a nickel he would walk younger kids home, guaranteeing they wouldn't be harassed. For a dime he'd fight their bullies for them. He wasn't the biggest boy on the block, but he was fearless and fast, and he learned how to take a punch without losing his resolve. Soon he developed a reputation. The kids on the street started calling him Lucky, not because of some miraculous good fortune, but because he seemed to survive every fight, every scrape, every beating that would have broken someone else. He walked away bruised, bleeding, but standing. And in the underbelly of the immigrant neighborhoods, survival was the ultimate form of luck. His first real taste of the criminal life came from necessity, not ambition. He joined a gang of young thieves who robbed pushcarts, picked pockets, and sold stolen cigarettes. The money wasn't big, but it was steady. And more importantly, it gave him a sense of control he had never felt before. He didn't have to beg. He didn't have to fear. He was taking what the world refused to give him. It was during these early years that he met the boys who would shape his future, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Their friendship began with a confrontation, Lansky refusing to pay a protection fee and standing his ground with a quiet intelligence that intrigued Luciano. The two recognized something in each other: ambition, calculation, and a willingness to break rules without letting emotions cloud their judgment. With Siegel it was different. Siegel was fire, chaos, a force of nature. Together, the trio balanced one another: brains, muscle, strategy. They were kids then, but they were kids who understood power better than most adults. Yet Luciano's rise wasn't a straight line. Streets that offered opportunity also demanded sacrifice. He became involved in drug running, prostitution, and hijacking. He was arrested several times, beaten more times than that. But every setback taught him something: who to trust, how to read danger, how to disappear when necessary. He learned the rhythms of the city, the flow of money, the movements of cops, the behavior of men when fear gripped them. The moment that changed everything came at age 24, when he was kidnapped by a rival gang, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead in a Staten Island marsh. His attackers carved into him so viciously that doctors later said he was lucky to be alive. They broke his bones, shattered his sense of invincibility, and left his face permanently altered, one eye drooping slightly, giving him a cold, half-lidded stare that would become iconic. But Luciano didn't retreat. The kidnapping awakened something darker inside him. He came out of it more calculating, more ruthless, more aware of how fragile life actually was. The world had shown him its cruelty, and instead of crushing him, it forged him into something sharper. He realized two things during those weeks of recovery. First, that fear was a powerful tool. Second, that the old guard, the mustache Pete's, would never respect men like him. If he wanted real power, he would have to take it, not wait for it to be offered. So he changed course. He began to distance himself from petty street crime and drew closer to influential figures like Joe Masuria. He learned the politics of the underworld, the art of negotiation, and the psychology of leadership. He studied men, how they reacted to threats, how they responded to respect, how loyalty could be shaped or broken. Through quiet observation he started to see patterns no one else noticed. His childhood had taught him survival. His youth had taught him brutality. But now, standing on the edge of adulthood, Luciano began to see the bigger picture. The streets were just the beginning, the city was the real prize. And as he climbed higher, he realized that the world he grew up in, chaotic, tribal and rigid, was unprepared for the force he was becoming. Behind every scar, every betrayal, every fight in the gutters of the Lower East Side, there was a lesson that pushed him toward his ultimate destiny. The boy named Salvatore Lucania was gone. Lucky Luciano was beginning to take shape, a man who would not only change the Mafia but redefine it entirely. He did not build his empire overnight. It began slowly, almost invisibly, like a ripple moving beneath the surface of a lake, quiet but powerful. By the time the older bosses noticed, Luciano had positioned himself so precisely that removing him would have been more dangerous than keeping him close. He understood something that no other gangster of his era fully grasped. Violence alone could win a street, but strategy could win a city. And in the America of the 1920s, a city meant an empire. Prohibition became the spark. When alcohol was outlawed in 1920, millions of ordinary Americans refused to stop drinking. Bars didn't close, they simply went underground. $1 trillion black market sprang open overnight. Most gangsters saw booze as a temporary cash grab. Luciano saw it as a once-in-a-century opportunity to reshape the entire criminal landscape. For the first time, he could study how supply chains worked, how distribution networks were built, how businessmen negotiated, how corruption could be structured like an investment. Crime was no longer about brute force, it was logistics. Under the rule of Joe the Boss Masuria, Luciano observed every flaw in the old system. Masuria demanded loyalty without offering vision. His leadership relied on fear, not respect. He rejected alliances with Jewish gangsters. He refused innovation. He clung to the past as if it were armor. Luciano realized that following Masuria would mean inheriting a broken kingdom, one destined to crumble under pressure. But working beside him gave Luciano the perfect vantage point. He quietly built relationships outside the Sicilian circle. Bootleggers, union men, corrupt cops, Irish politicians, Jewish financiers, nightclub owners, even Hollywood figures who wanted a taste of New York's nightlife. This network became the skeleton of what would soon be the American Mafia. At the center of that network were Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. They weren't just friends anymore, they were partners. Lansky brought numbers, discipline, a deep understanding of money flow. Siegel brought violence and loyalty, the kind of loyalty that didn't require explanation. Together with Luciano, they created an informal alliance that ignored ethnic lines, something unheard of at the time. Crime in America was becoming multicultural, not by accident but by design. With prohibition profits soaring, Luciano began standardizing the business. He introduced new rules: no unnecessary killings, no impulsive wars, no territorial arrogance. Instead, he emphasized efficiency, negotiation, and shared profits. He arranged meetings between rival gangs. He set up mediation protocols. He pushed for expansion into nightclubs, brothels, and gambling dens. He saw crime not as a battlefield but as a corporation. But corporations need structure, and the Mafia had none. This became Luciano's obsession. How do you take thousands of criminals, spread across 5 boroughs, each with ego and hunger and guns, and organize them into a machine that can run without constant bloodshed? The Mustache Pete's believed power existed only in tradition and fear. Luciano believed power existed in systems. He began designing one quietly, sketching out ideas with Lansky in hotel rooms, diners, and back offices. Their discussions were visionary. A nationwide syndicate, a ruling council, a division of territories, profit sharing, dispute resolution, even long-term investments. It was criminal modernism. While shaping the future, Luciano played the present with expert precision. He pretended to be loyal to Masuria while establishing secret alliances with the man's greatest rival, Salvatore Maranzano. This duplicity required extraordinary nerve. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and Luciano would be found shot in a ditch. But he understood that the old world had to be dismantled carefully, piece by piece, without alerting the men who still believed they controlled everything. The turning point came during the Castellamarese War, a brutal mafia conflict that consumed New York in the early 1930s. While Masuria and Maranzano ordered killings based on ancient grudges, Luciano saw a different truth. Both men were obstacles. Neither understood the need for innovation. Neither would ever allow a young American-born upstart to take the reins. If Luciano wanted to create the empire he envisioned, both bosses had to go. And so he orchestrated one of the most legendary power plays in Mafia history. First, Joe Masuria. Luciano lured him to a Coney Island restaurant, shared a quiet lunch with him, excused himself to use the restroom, and walked away as his own men stormed in and executed Mafia in a flurry of gunfire. Maranzano thought Luciano had proven loyalty. He didn't realize he was next. After Maranzano declared himself boss of all bosses, Luciano saw immediately that nothing had changed. The mustache Pete mentality remained alive. So a few months later Luciano struck again. He sent men disguised as IRS agents into Maranzano's office. They stabbed and shot the Mafia's last Old World ruler, ending centuries of Sicilian hierarchy in America in a single afternoon. With both bosses gone, the underworld entered a power vacuum, but Luciano didn't rule through fear. He ruled through structure. He formed the Commission, a governing body representing the major crime families. No more absolute dictators. No more unnecessary wars. All disputes would be mediated. All decisions would be rational. The Mafia became a corporation with shareholders, boundaries, and strategy. Luciano's vision was complete, a flexible, efficient, nationwide syndicate capable of outliving its founders. He didn't just build an empire. He built a system, one so strong that decades later, even after RICO trials, informants, and federal crackdowns, the structure still survived. It was the backbone of organized crime across America, and it began with a young immigrant who refused to accept the chaos he grew up in. As power consolidated around him, Luciano stepped into a new identity. He was no longer a survivor of the streets, no longer Masuria's subordinate, no longer a kid fighting bullies for pennies. He was the architect of modern organized crime, the man who turned violence into policy and ambition into infrastructure. The empire he built would shape history for generations, an empire born not from luck, but from vision. The deeper the protagonist stepped into the abandoned corridor, the more the air seemed to cling to his skin, thick and unmoving, as if the entire passageway had been sealed from the world for centuries. Every breath carried a faint metallic taste like rust and old blood, and the silence was so complete it felt unnatural, too heavy, too deliberate, as if something unseen were holding its breath along with him. His flashlight cut through the darkness in a narrow beam, revealing cracked tiles, peeling paint and faint, almost invisible fingerprints smeared across the walls. He didn't know whether they belonged to the living or the dead. Each step echoed softly, bouncing back from the narrow walls in a whisper-like delay that made him constantly turn around, expecting to see someone following inches behind. His mind tried to reason with him, reminding him that echoes were just sound bouncing off surfaces, but the echo wasn't behaving like sound. It was slower, uneven, like footsteps that didn't match his own rhythm. The corridor was long, too long for a building of this size. He realized with a jolt that he should have reached the central hall minutes ago, but instead the hall never appeared, the passage stretching ahead endlessly like a nightmare loop. A cold tremor ran across the back of his neck, not from imagination but from something real, a draft, impossibly cold, drifting past him from deeper within the hallway. The building had no power, no open windows, no functioning ventilation, so there should not have been any airflow at all. Yet the draft carried a faint scent, like damp earth freshly disturbed. He felt the instinctive tightening in his chest, the primal alertness humans only feel when they are not alone in the dark. The beam of his flashlight flickered, just once, like a pulse, and for a split second the darkness swallowed everything. In that split second he heard it, soft, dragging, something brushing against the floor somewhere ahead of him. He froze. The sound didn't repeat, but the memory of it clung to him, vibrating in his bones. His throat tightened as he forced himself to continue forward, each step slower, quieter, as if walking through a dream where the ground threatened to crumble beneath him. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, not with the randomness of imagination but with intention, slow, controlled, observing. The corridor's walls felt like they were narrowing around him, guiding him forward, trapping him in a single path he could no longer turn back from. He whispered to himself that it was just an illusion created by fear, but deep down he knew something in the darkness was awake, and listening. He could feel the corridor breathing now, not with lungs, not with life, but with an ancient stillness that pulsed quietly, almost rhythmically, like the heartbeat of the building itself. The deeper he moved, the more the darkness seemed to shift in subtle, unsettling ways. It wasn't simply the absence of light, it was a presence, a thick and intentional veil that refused to let his flashlight seep too far beyond a few short steps. He noticed the temperature dropping, each second carving a layer of frost-like cold into his skin. His fingertips numbed around the metal of his flashlight, but he forced himself to keep walking, to keep looking ahead, even as every instinct in him screamed to turn back. His footsteps softened to a cautious glide, the kind one makes when they know something is near, something that can hear the slightest sound. His breath hitched when he noticed that the corridor floor, once covered in dust, now bore faint trails. They were thin at first, almost unnoticeable, but as he followed them deeper, they became distinct, long dragging marks, as if something had been pulled or had slithered its way forward. Each mark held a different shape, some curved, some jagged, none consistent with anything human. His pulse quickened. His mind conjured questions he didn't dare answer. But he kept moving because something in the air, some strange pull, made turning back feel more dangerous than going forward. He paused when he reached a section of the hallway where the walls were covered in old, damp wallpaper, yellowed with age, peeling in curled strips that resembled dead skin. He moved the flashlight closer. Symbols had been scratched underneath the peeling paper, thin and erratic lines carved by something sharp and impatient. They weren't words, not in any language he recognized, but the patterns felt deliberate, ritualistic, almost desperate. Some lines overlapped, etched again and again as if someone had carved until their hand bled or until the wall could no longer take the force. He reached out with hesitant fingers, stopping inches away, afraid to touch what felt like an echo of someone's last moment. His breathing became shallow. The hallway behind him seemed to tighten, as though the darkness was closing its grip, pushing him forward. He turned his head slightly, just enough to check behind him. His light revealed an empty corridor, lifeless, unmoving. But something felt different, like the shadows were rearranging themselves whenever he wasn't looking. Then suddenly, a faint sound broke through the silence. Not a whisper. Not a breath. A small, almost inaudible tap. Then another. Then another, like fingernails slowly tapping on the floor behind him. He whipped his flashlight around, heart slamming in his chest. Nothing. Just the long corridor stretching back into blackness. Yet the tapping continued, softer now, more patient, as if whatever made the sound knew he could hear it and wanted him to. The tapping grew closer, inch by inch, but still nothing appeared in the flashlight beam. He stepped backward, instinct tightening every muscle, his breath growing shaky. The tapping stopped immediately when he moved, as if reacting to him. Then the corridor fell back into an unnatural silence. He forced himself to turn forward again and continue deeper into the passage. His legs felt heavier now, as though each step took more effort than the last. The air shifted again, colder, and the smell changed, wet, rotten, the scent of wood eaten away by time and something else, something organic. The flashlight beam shook in his hand, not because he was afraid, though he was, but because the air had grown so cold that his fingers were losing their strength. The corridor ahead turned slightly, not a full corner but a gentle curve that obscured whatever lay beyond. He stopped at the bend, listening. The silence felt thicker here, almost suffocating. His chest rose and fell slowly as he leaned slightly around the curve. The moment he did, his flashlight flickered again, this time longer, stuttering like a dying heartbeat. In the brief second the light dimmed, he saw movement. Not clearly. Not defined. Just a shift, a flutter of darkness moving across the wall. When the light steadied, the space was empty. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. He turned the corner fully. The corridor widened here, just enough to feel wrong, as though the architecture had been stretched unnaturally. The walls bore darker stains, long streaks trailing down to the floor. In the center of the widened space lay something that made his stomach knot. A pile of objects, small, pale shapes scattered in a messy, deliberate arrangement. He moved closer, dread tightening every nerve. Bones. Small ones first, like those of birds or rodents. But beneath them were larger fragments. A rib. A partial jaw. A hand, small but unmistakably human. The fingertips were worn, the nails cracked as if the person had clawed at something endlessly. He stumbled back, the breath leaving him in a sharp exhale. His flashlight trembled violently now. The corridor behind him remained silent, but he could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing into him, studying him, deciding something about him. Every part of him wanted to run back the way he came, to escape the suffocating grip of the passageway. But when he glanced back, the corridor seemed darker, thicker, like a void waiting to swallow him the moment he stepped into it. He turned forward again, refusing to let panic take over. He stepped carefully around the pile of bones, trying not to disturb anything. As he passed, a sudden gust of cold air swept across the floor, swirling around the bones and making them clatter faintly against one another. The sound echoed like brittle chimes in a dead wind. His heart hammered. He pushed deeper still, because at this point he felt trapped between two impossible choices: go back into the growing darkness behind him, or continue moving toward the unknown ahead. The unknown felt less suffocating. Barely. As he walked, the tapping returned, this time from ahead of him. Light taps, rhythmic, deliberate, like something pacing slowly in front of him. He stopped. The tapping stopped. He breathed. The tapping resumed, a little faster now, almost excited. His hands trembled. He took one step forward. The tapping accelerated. 2 more steps. The tapping suddenly stopped again. Then came the whisper. Not from a mouth. Not from any direction. It rose from the walls, from the floor, from inside the very air he breathed. A thin, strained voice stretched like fabric about to tear. It spoke no words, only a trembling, broken sound like someone trying to form a cry but failing. A sound of something that had been alone in the dark too long. His knees weakened. The flashlight shook so much it cast chaotic shadows across the walls. But he kept moving, barely able to breathe now, stepping deeper into the darkness that seemed to pulse with every beat of his heart. Something was waiting for him. And whatever it was, it had just realized he was getting close. The moment he stepped into the next stretch of the corridor, he felt the atmosphere shift again. Subtly at first, like a faint pressure around his temples, but then stronger, tightening like an invisible hand closing slowly around his skull. The faint whisper he had heard earlier didn't return, but its absence felt worse. Silence now carried weight, as if the corridor itself was holding its breath, listening not just to his footsteps, but to the very thoughts forming in his mind. His heartbeat echoed loudly in his ears, almost too loud, as though something inside the walls was mimicking the rhythm, matching it beat for beat. He aimed his flashlight forward, but the beam seemed weaker than before. Not fading, being swallowed. The darkness ahead wasn't simply dark. It was dense, almost physical, like a thick smoke that absorbed light rather than reflected it. He took a slow step forward, and the cold deepened instantly, seeping through his clothes as if reaching directly for his bones. His breath left his mouth in long, trembling clouds that drifted unevenly, dissolving before they reached the far end of the beam. The walls here looked different. They were smoother, almost polished, reflecting faint glimmers of light like wet stone. But he knew this building didn't have stone walls. He moved closer, shining the flashlight onto the surface. It glistened, not with water but with a thin, translucent sheen, as if coated with something organic. He leaned slightly, squinting. The texture looked disturbingly like stretched skin, taut and pale, with veins visible underneath the surface. He pulled back instantly, stomach twisting, throat tightening with a sudden urge to gag. Just then he heard it. A slow, deliberate inhale. Not from behind him. Not from ahead. From the wall beside him. He froze, every muscle locking in place. The inhale grew deeper, almost thoughtful, as though tasting the air around him. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence behind. He didn't move. His eyes remained locked on the strange wall surface, afraid to turn his back on it. After several tense seconds, he forced himself to take a step forward, heart hammering so hard he could feel it shaking his ribs. The corridor narrowed again, subtly at first, then more noticeably until both walls seemed to press inward. The ceiling lowered as well, giving the claustrophobic impression that the passageway was slowly folding itself into a throat-like shape. The faint pulsation in the air returned, now steady, slow, rhythmic, too similar to a heartbeat to be ignored. He walked faster, not out of confidence but desperation, a growing fear that if he moved too slowly, the corridor might close around him entirely. A faint scraping sound echoed from somewhere behind him. Not fast. Not approaching. Just dragging, slow, lazy, confident, like something that had all the time in the world to follow him. He refused to look back. He could feel the sensation of being watched now, not from one direction but from everywhere. The air prickled against the back of his neck, crawling like invisible fingers. The corridor floor changed next. The cold tile he had been walking on gradually became softer, almost spongy under his shoes. He frowned and knelt slightly, shining the light downward. The floor was covered in a patchy layer of dark fibers, long, thin, hair-like strands that swayed gently despite the still air. When he stepped again, the strands curled slightly around his shoe, as if reacting to his presence. He jerked his foot back instantly, breath-catching, and hurried forward with fast, shallow steps to avoid the unsettling texture. Halfway through this strange section, his flashlight flickered again, but this time, it didn't recover immediately. The darkness swallowed him for nearly 2 full seconds. In that brief blackout, he heard shuffling directly behind him, impossibly close. So close he felt the faint displacement of air against the collar of his shirt, like something had leaned in to smell him. The light snapped back on. Nothing was there. But he wasn't imagining the warmth he still felt lingering against the back of his neck, or the faint sound of a long exhale dissipating behind him. His breath trembled as he forced himself deeper into the corridor. He could no longer tell how far he had walked or how long he had been inside this twisting nightmare of a passageway. Time felt stretched, distorted, like everything past the entrance existed outside reality. The deeper he went, the more the architecture betrayed all logic. Corners shifted subtly when he wasn't looking. The floor seemed to tilt at odd angles. Shadows stretched too far, too slowly, as if moving independently from any source of light. Then he reached a spot that made him stop dead. At the far end of the corridor, several feet ahead, the darkness wasn't just thick, it was shaped. A silhouette stood there. Tall, facing him. His flashlight landed on it, but instead of illuminating the form, the beam broke apart against it, dissolving like smoke against a solid void. He felt his breath freeze in his throat. The silhouette didn't move. It didn't breathe. It didn't sway. It simply existed, unnervingly still, as though it had been waiting in that exact spot for a very long time. He whispered something to himself, a shaky reassurance, though he didn't even hear the words he uttered. His hand tightened around the flashlight, knuckles whitening. The silhouette didn't react. But the hallway did. A distant hum vibrated through the walls, a deep, low, resonant sound that made his teeth ache. The silhouette seemed to darken further, as if drawing the darkness toward itself. He took a single step backward. The silhouette shifted. Not a full movement, just a tilt, a subtle lean of the head like it had noticed him for the first time. Cold shot through him like a blade of ice. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He didn't move. The silhouette leaned a little more. A slow realization crept over him, chilling him to the core. It wasn't standing. It was hanging. Suspended. Swaying ever so slightly in a breathless, airless corridor. And whatever had hung it might still be here. He stood frozen, staring at the hanging silhouette ahead, unable to move, unable to think. The figure swayed with an unnatural rhythm, as if moved by a wind that didn't exist in the suffocating stillness of the corridor. His throat tightened, and a tremor spread through his limbs, making the flashlight shake just enough to send the beam fluttering across the walls. Each slight movement of light warped the shadows in disturbing ways, stretching them, bending them, making them crawl across the surfaces as though alive. He couldn't tell if it was the trembling of his hand or the corridor itself shifting again, but every shadow seemed to lean toward him, silent and hungry. A pressure grew in his chest as the air thickened, almost syrup-like, refusing to move properly through his lungs. He tried to breathe slowly, but even the act of drawing a breath felt wrong, like inhaling something heavy, something old. The hanging figure remained still except for that subtle, ghostly sway, and he felt a strange compulsion pulling him closer. He didn't want to go near it, yet something in the silent beat of the corridor tugged at him, urging him forward as if the darkness itself wanted him to witness whatever secret this place held. The deeper part of his mind, the instinctive animal part, screamed at him to turn around, to run, to claw his way out of this place before it consumed him. But logic had abandoned him long ago. He no longer trusted his sense of distance, his understanding of time, even the reliability of his own eyes. Nothing in this corridor obeyed the rules of the world he knew. What if turning around only led him deeper inside? What if running made the thing in the dark move faster? He took a slow step forward, the sound of his shoe brushing against the strange hair-coated floor seeming disproportionately loud in the silence. The silhouette responded, not with movement but with presence. The darkness around it thickened, expanding like a slow exhale as though acknowledging his approach. The hair on the back of his neck stood erect again, an involuntary warning. Till he moved. His flashlight beam grazed the hanging figure's lower half, briefly illuminating what appeared to be fabric, torn, worn, and stained from age or something far worse. As he stepped closer, he saw that the legs didn't hang naturally. They were twisted slightly as though the body had been rotated, suspended mid-turn. His breath caught, and for a moment he couldn't swallow as he realized the impossible. There was no rope. No chain. Nothing attached to the ceiling. The figure simply hung there, weightless, held up by something unseen. A sudden vibration pulsed through the floor, near soundless but powerful enough to rattle his bones. The walls seemed to tremble in response, a slow wave rippling down the length of the hallway like a heartbeat echoing through stone. The corridor dimmed, the light draining from the edges of the walls as though drawn toward the figure. His flashlight grew weaker yet again, the beam shrinking despite fresh batteries he'd placed in it only hours earlier. He smacked it lightly out of instinct, but the beam only narrowed further, focusing like a cold spotlight on the figure ahead. Then something new happened. A sound drifted forward, soft, almost accidental. A faint tapping, like fingernails gently brushing against a hollow surface. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from above him. He slowly looked up, terrified of what he might find, but the ceiling was buried in layers of shadow so dense that even the flashlight beam refused to penetrate it. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, moving along the length of the ceiling as though something crawled there, tracking him. He stepped backward just one step and the tapping instantly stopped. Silence. Total. Absolute. Then a soft scrape, just behind him. His blood turned to ice. He spun around, the flashlight whipping with his movement, and for the briefest moment he saw something low to the ground darting back into the darkness at an impossible speed. Though he hadn't seen its shape clearly, he felt the intent behind its movement. It wasn't fleeing. It was circling. His breathing grew ragged, uncontrolled. He forced himself to keep the light steady, sweeping the beam across the corridor, but everything looked wrong now. The walls seemed to pulse with movement, the floor fibers swayed even without contact, and the darkness behind him crept closer, almost touching his back like an unseen hand reaching out. He turned toward the hanging figure again, and felt his stomach drop. It was closer. Not by inches but by several feet. The figure now hung only a short distance away, the darkness around it thickening into a fog-like shroud. His knees weakened and he stumbled backward, nearly losing his grip on the flashlight. He hadn't heard it move, hadn't seen it shift, but it was undeniably closer. Panic surged through him, sharp and electric. He blinked hard, wiping sweat from his eyes, hoping it was an illusion, but when he opened them again, the thing had inched even nearer. He could see details now. A face, or what was left of one. Gray, stretched skin pulled tight across bone. Empty sockets staring directly at him. A jaw hanging slightly open as though mid-whisper. And the moment his flashlight hit its face full-on, the jaw twitched. Just once, a soft ripple through the decayed flesh that sent cold terror tearing through him. He stumbled backward again, heart thundering. The corridor behind him seemed to shift, the walls bending inward, narrowing like a throat preparing to swallow him whole. He glanced back, calculating escape, but the darkness had pooled there so heavily it looked solid, like a wall of shadow. He didn't dare step into it. When he turned forward again, the hanging figure was no longer hanging. It stood. Its feet touched the floor. Its head tilted. And its body leaned toward him, the darkness behind it swelling like wings unfolding. He backed away in blind panic, breath shattering, mind fracturing under the impossible reality stretching around him. Something whispered, very softly, directly beside his ear, though no one stood there. "You're almost there." He didn't know if the voice meant rescue or ruin. But he knew this. Whatever waited ahead was worse than what followed behind. He could feel the walls closing in now, though he knew they hadn't physically moved. The corridor itself seemed alive, bending, breathing, pressing against him with every step he took. His flashlight flickered violently, throwing grotesque shadows across the walls, turning the narrow hallway into a shifting, undulating nightmare. The air was thick with a metallic tang, sharp and biting, like blood mixed with rust and wet earth. Each inhale felt heavy, like he was drawing in more than air, something old, something that belonged to the building itself. His heart pounded in his chest, loud enough that it almost drowned out the subtle sounds of movement in the corridor. Dragging, scraping, a faint shuffle, almost imperceptible, echoing behind him, but he dared not turn. The hanging figure, or whatever it had become, loomed in his peripheral vision, its presence palpable, even when he couldn't see it clearly. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to escape before the corridor closed entirely, before the darkness claimed him completely. Yet another part, a darker part, urged him forward. Curiosity, defiance, the terrible compulsion to see, to know, to survive by understanding the entity that stalked this cursed space. The floor beneath him shifted again. It had become uneven, soft in some spots, hard in others, giving way in ways that defied logic. His boots sank slightly into areas that felt like damp soil, only to be met with resistance the next step. He realized, with a cold thrill of horror, that the corridor was testing him, measuring his balance, gauging his endurance. The shadows along the walls stretched unnaturally, reaching out toward him like elongated fingers, some solid, some faint, all moving independently. He tried to focus on the flashlight beam, but the longer he stared, the more it seemed to contract, pulling the world into a tunnel of darkness around him. A faint whisper drifted through the corridor, almost lost among the irregular echoes of his steps. Not words. Not sentences. Just a sound, a vibration like someone exhaling the same breath over and over again, shaping it into an audible rhythm. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere at once, behind him, in front of him, inside the walls, beneath the floor. He froze, a cold sweat running down his spine, realizing that the corridor itself had become a living listener, aware of his presence, aware of his fear. He took another step forward, heart hammering, the flashlight trembling in his grip. The hanging figure, or its shadow, moved again. This time unmistakably. Its limbs, long and thin, bent at angles that should have been impossible, its head tilting with an intelligence that terrified him. And then he saw it clearly, the face pale, almost translucent, eyes empty but somehow aware, the lips drawn back as if in a silent scream or perhaps a warning. His stomach churned violently. He wanted to look away, to close his eyes and retreat, but fascination and terror wove together into a compulsion he could not resist. Something shifted in the air, a soft, almost imperceptible vibration that ran up through his boots and into his spine. The corridor ahead seemed darker now, denser, as if the shadows had thickened into a solid mass, swallowing the walls and ceiling in blackness. He felt it before he saw it, a presence, massive and deliberate, moving in the darkness just beyond the flashlight's reach. It didn't make a sound at first, but he could sense it observing him, calculating, waiting. His mind screamed that he should retreat, that he should flee, but his body had frozen. He was caught between the irresistible pull of the unknown and the raw terror that clawed at his chest. The dragging sound returned, soft, slow, deliberate, coming from just behind him. He didn't look. He couldn't. But the knowledge of its proximity made his skin crawl. The corridor seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally, forcing him to take step after step, each one heavier than the last, as though the floor itself were resisting him. Sweat ran down his temples, mixing with the dust and grime on his face. His breathing was ragged, shallow, desperate. Every inhale carried the sharp taste of iron and decay, every exhale trembled like the whisper of a dying wind. He forced himself to move forward. The corridor narrowed again, squeezing him from both sides. His shoulder brushed against the walls, which felt damp, almost sticky, as if the very structure of the building had grown flesh. Something beneath his feet shifted, and he stumbled slightly, his heart racing, flashlight shaking in panic. The hanging figure, or whatever it had become, loomed closer with every step, its presence undeniable, its intent clear. He could feel the darkness around it stretching, pulsating, reaching toward him like tendrils, testing his resolve, probing for weakness. Then came the whisper again. Not a sound carried by air but by the corridor itself. It was a voice he felt rather than heard, low and vibrating deep inside his chest. He couldn't understand the words, yet he comprehended their meaning perfectly. Warning. Invitation. Judgment. The voice wrapped around him, bending the shadows closer, pressing the cold deeper into his bones. He felt the corridor closing in entirely, yet somehow knew there was one final threshold ahead, one point where the truth of this place waited. He didn't know if stepping through would lead to salvation, revelation, or complete destruction. Summoning the last of his courage, he advanced toward the source of the presence. Each step was agony, each breath a struggle against the suffocating pressure in the air. The darkness thickened with every movement, yet his eyes adjusted slightly, perceiving faint forms in the gloom, shapes that shifted and writhed at the edge of perception, almost human, almost familiar, but impossibly distorted. The hanging figure followed, moving silently, swaying slightly, its empty eyes fixed on him, pulling him forward. Then he saw it, a faint glimmer on the far wall, like a slit of moonlight, impossibly bright in the suffocating darkness. It marked the end of the corridor, or perhaps a passage beyond this world entirely. Relief surged momentarily, only to be replaced instantly by a fresh wave of terror. The floor trembled beneath him. The shadows writhed violently. The figure ahead stretched, its limbs elongating, twisting in ways that defied logic. The corridor itself seemed to tilt, angles bending and folding, swallowing light, air, and reason. He stepped forward toward the glimmer. And with that single step the corridor reacted. The hanging figure lunged, not in a physical sense but with the force of presence. The walls pulsed, the air thickened, the darkness pressed inward, and a sound, low, guttural, resonant, filled the space, vibrating through his chest and teeth. He stumbled but forced himself to continue. Something deep inside him screamed, but he ignored it. There, just ahead, the faint light revealed the final threshold. A doorway carved directly from shadow, impossibly tall, its edges blurred, vibrating like the very air was alive. He took a breath, steadied the trembling flashlight, and moved forward, knowing with certainty that crossing this threshold would change everything, whether he survived or not. Because the corridor was no longer just a passage. It had become a predator, a judge, a mirror of his own fear. And the thing at the end, waiting in the black doorway, was the final truth he had been chasing, and would soon confront. He hesitated at the threshold, staring into the darkness that stretched beyond the doorway. It was no longer just the corridor he had traversed, it was something alive, something aware, something that had been waiting for him. The air here was heavier, laden with a sense of expectation and menace so profound that every breath felt like inhaling a physical weight pressing against his chest. The faint glimmer that had marked the passage's end seemed to pulse in response to his heartbeat, and for a moment, he wondered if the corridor had been measuring him all along, guiding him, testing him, preparing him for this encounter. He stepped forward. The floor beneath him was uneven, softer in places, yet solid enough to support his weight. The walls pressed closer, narrower than any hallway should be, and the shadows around him thickened into shapes that moved with independent intent. Each step sent echoes that seemed to linger far too long, bouncing back with a distorted tone, like a chorus of whispers from the unseen. The figure that had haunted him through the corridor swayed slightly in front of him, following silently, its presence oppressive yet hypnotic. He felt drawn to it, repelled and attracted simultaneously, like a moth circling a flame it knows will burn. As he approached, he realized the doorway itself was unusual. The edges were blurred, as if vibrating between two realities. Shadows poured from its frame, not static but writhing, slithering, almost liquid in their movement. A low hum emanated from the doorway, barely audible but felt deep in his chest and bones. He could feel it reverberating, harmonizing with the faint pulse he had sensed in the corridor, an invisible heartbeat that seemed to guide him forward. He shivered involuntarily. The entire building felt alive now, sentient, holding him in place, both predator and host. The figure in front of him shifted suddenly. No longer swaying, it advanced a single step, weightless, silent, deliberate. Its empty sockets bore into him, making him feel naked, stripped of control, every secret laid bare under that gaze. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, but forced himself to continue. Fear had become a kind of propulsion, driving him forward even as it threatened to paralyze him. His eyes caught the faintest detail. The face, if it could be called that, seemed to breathe in time with him, a grotesque mimicry of life, its hollow jaw stretching into something like a grin. He reached the doorway and peered inside. The light from his flashlight barely penetrated, revealing nothing at first, only a void that seemed to swallow even the edges of the beam. Then shapes emerged, indistinct, twisting forms that floated just beyond perception. They moved slowly, unnaturally, as if existing on a different plane. Their motion was deliberate, purposeful, yet incomprehensible, defying the normal rules of movement. He realized with a sickening clarity that the corridor had been preparing him for this, acclimating him to the impossible, shaping his perception, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. The figure in front of him drifted closer, and he could feel its intent, a silent awareness that it was studying him as he studied it. He felt a profound unease, the realization that he was no longer merely observing, but participating in something larger than comprehension. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, to retreat, but the doorway pulsed with a strange compulsion, drawing him forward with an irresistible force. It was the culmination of everything the corridor had demanded of him. Courage, endurance, observation, and now confrontation. He took a slow step inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the corridor behind him seemed to vanish. Shadows collapsed, the air thickened to a palpable pressure, and the low hum intensified, resonating directly with his chest. He was no longer merely a traveler in the hallway. He had entered a space beyond conventional boundaries, a liminal zone where perception itself was fragile. Forms swirled around him, neither solid nor entirely intangible. Whispers rose from nowhere, threading through the air with indistinct syllables that teased his comprehension. The figure remained ahead, stationary yet fully aware, waiting, testing. He tried to focus, to rationalize, but logic faltered in this environment. Shapes moved outside the limits of his understanding. Distances warped, perspectives shifted, and time seemed elastic, stretching moments into eternities. He realized with a cold clarity that the entity he faced was not bound by the laws he knew. It was older, patient, existing on a level that humans could scarcely perceive. Its presence alone demanded obedience, compliance, recognition. He felt like an intruder in a world he could never fully inhabit. And yet he moved closer. Each step brought him deeper into a psychological labyrinth, every sense assaulted simultaneously. The whispers coalesced into fleeting fragments of words, warnings, invitations, judgments. They slipped through his mind like water through fingers, impossible to hold, yet leaving an indelible imprint. His chest tightened. The air itself seemed to press against his skin, cold and unyielding. The figure's presence expanded, filling the space around him, asserting dominion over perception and fear. He realized he could no longer distinguish between the corridor, the doorway, the figure, and himself. Everything blended into a singular, overwhelming experience. A confrontation not just with an external entity, but with the deepest layers of his own psyche. Memories surfaced unbidden, insecurities, doubts, instinctive fears, the primal need to survive. The figure reflected them all, amplifying, shaping, observing. He hesitated. One more step and he would cross the final boundary. One more heartbeat and he would face the truth behind the corridor, the figure, and the oppressive darkness that had stalked him from the first step. A shiver ran down his spine as he raised the flashlight, pointing it directly at the figure. Its hollow sockets fixed on him, unmoving, and yet, he felt their gaze pierce through him, past the flesh, past the fear, straight into the core of who he was. He stepped forward. And the corridor responded. The walls seemed to pulse, the floor shifted beneath him, and the air thickened into a viscous weight that pressed against his chest like molten iron. Shapes swirled violently around him, the whispers coalesced into a cacophony of sound and sensation, and the figure moved, suddenly, impossibly, closer than it had ever been. A shock of terror gripped him, primal and consuming, as he realized the final confrontation had begun. It was no longer about fleeing or surviving. It was about understanding, facing, accepting. The corridor, the darkness, the figure, all of it converged into one overwhelming presence. And in that moment he understood the truth. This was the point of the journey, the ultimate test. What came next would define not just what he saw, but who he was, and whether he could leave the darkness behind or be consumed by it entirely. The figure's presence pressed against him like a living weight, a gravity that defied the physical laws he had known. Every fiber of his being screamed, urging him to retreat, yet some unseen force rooted him to the spot, compelling him to advance, to see, to confront what had been waiting for him. The air vibrated with a resonance that he could feel in his bones, a low, omnipresent hum that seemed to echo the rhythm of his own heart. Shadows writhed around him, twisting and coiling like serpents, yet he could sense their intelligence, their awareness, their patient observation. They were not mere reflections of light or imagination. They were extensions of the corridor itself, extensions of the entity before him. He raised the flashlight shakily, trying to illuminate the figure fully, yet the beam seemed inadequate, as if the darkness itself resisted exposure. The figure remained still, unmoving in position but alive in its intent. Its head tilted, slight and deliberate, watching, analyzing, and he felt an unbearable scrutiny, as if every secret he had ever carried was visible to it, every lie he had ever told reflected in its hollow gaze. The skin, or what passed for skin, pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, a subtle rhythm that synchronized with the growing intensity of his fear. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his trembling hands, his pulse racing in violent irregularity, yet each heartbeat only seemed to draw the entity's presence closer, thickening the darkness, tightening the air around him. A sudden shift in the shadows made him flinch. The figure had moved, or perhaps the corridor itself had altered its shape. Distances no longer made sense. Angles warped in ways that his mind could not calculate. The floor beneath him seemed to pulse with every step, responding to his weight, his intention, his very awareness. The whispers returned, closer now, sharper, slicing through the thick air in fragmented syllables. He could not discern words, yet he understood their meaning: observation, judgment, invitation. They pressed against his mind, threading through memory and fear, stirring recollections of mistakes, regrets, and long-buried anxieties. He stepped closer, compelled by a mixture of terror and fascination. The figure responded in subtle ways, a tilt of the head, a pulse through the surrounding shadows, an almost imperceptible movement of limbs. Each gesture sent waves of cold through him, waves that resonated with a profound sense of inevitability. He realized with growing clarity that this entity was not merely an obstacle, nor a predator in the conventional sense. It was a mirror, a reflection of his deepest fears and his rawest truths. It had watched him navigate the corridor, observed his reactions to impossible stimuli, and now waited to confront him with the culmination of all that he had experienced. The flashlight flickered violently, and he caught a glimpse of the figure's face, hollow, gray, almost skeletal, yet animated in a way that suggested intelligence and awareness. The eyes, empty yet perceiving, fixed on him with a patient, penetrating focus. His breath hitched, every inhale drawing in the oppressive weight of the air, every exhale trembling in response to the invisible pressure. Sweat ran down his temples and his legs felt unsteady, but still he moved, compelled forward by a force he could not resist. Suddenly the shadows themselves began to shift more aggressively, coiling, twisting, pushing against the light, forcing him to adjust his path. The figure advanced subtly, impossibly, closing the distance without breaking the laws of space as he understood them. He stumbled slightly, feeling the floor warp beneath him, but recovered, driven by a need to reach the figure, to confront the unknown, to survive by understanding it. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, forming a layered resonance that pierced directly into his consciousness. Memory and fear intertwined. He could feel his own doubts laid bare, the failures and regrets of his life magnified and reflected in the tension of the corridor and the intent of the figure. He stopped, breath ragged, hands trembling violently. The figure remained just a few feet away, its presence overwhelming, every inch of space between them vibrating with anticipation. The air was charged, dense, thick with expectation, as though the entity itself waited for him to take a final action, to step forward, to yield, or to confront fully. The corridor behind him seemed to recede, the shadows closing into themselves, leaving only the figure, the pulsing darkness, and the oppressive, vibrating atmosphere that clung to every nerve in his body. Slowly he raised the flashlight higher, illuminating more of the figure. The distorted form became clearer, revealing details impossible to reconcile with life as he knew it. The skin, stretched taut over angular bones, pulsed rhythmically as though alive. The hollow sockets seemed to flicker, like dim embers in the darkest night. The jaw twitched slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible motion that made his stomach knot. His pulse accelerated. The corridor hummed, the shadows coiled tighter, and the air seemed to thicken even further. In that suspended moment, he understood with a clarity that chilled him. The figure was not only observing him but responding directly to his presence, his intentions, his fear. Every step he had taken, every reaction he had produced, had been noted, analyzed, measured. This confrontation was inevitable, the climax of the corridor's design, the culmination of every test, every whisper, every shadow and shift. It demanded a choice, and only through confrontation could he move beyond it. He took another step forward. The figure mirrored him subtly, its presence shifting closer in synchronization. The corridor's walls pulsed, the shadows stretched, and the whispers became coherent for the first time, a resonance that vibrated directly within his chest and bones. Though he could not discern words, he understood their essence. Face it. Understand. Survive. The final step brought him within arm's reach. He could feel the cold radiating from the figure, the oppressive weight of its awareness pressing directly against him. The whispers became deafening within his mind, echoing, overlapping, a cacophony of perception that left him trembling, yet compelled him forward. He understood now. The corridor, the figure, the shadows, they were a single entity, a test of courage, perception, and will. The only way to move beyond it was to confront it fully, without flinching, without fear. He steadied himself, flashlight fixed firmly, heart hammering, legs unsteady but rooted in resolve. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. The figure remained, patient, unyielding, alive in a way that transcended conventional understanding. And as he met its hollow gaze, he realized that the confrontation was no longer just external. It was internal, a reflection of his deepest fears, his resilience, and his capacity to endure the impossible. The corridor waited. The figure waited. And he stepped forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, a sudden clarity washed over him, yet it was not relief, it was recognition. The corridor, the shadows, the figure, they had all been a prelude, a preparation, a test that he had been navigating blindfolded, and now the final stage stretched before him. The darkness here was no longer merely absence of light. It was tangible, almost sentient, pressing against him, brushing against his skin like a living, breathing entity. He could feel the pulse of it in the floor, the walls, even in the air around him, and it synchronized with his own heartbeat in a way that was almost intimate, almost invasive. He took a careful step forward, each movement deliberate, his senses straining to capture every vibration, every whisper, every subtle distortion of reality. The floor beneath his feet shifted subtly, softening under his weight as though testing his balance and resolve. He could feel it yield in some places, resist in others, almost as if the corridor itself were alive, guiding him, challenging him, bending his perception of space. The shadows stretched and coiled around him, responding to his movement, reshaping themselves as he advanced. He raised the flashlight, but the beam wavered, splintered against the dense, pulsing darkness, illuminating only fragments of the world ahead. Shapes moved there, half-seen, impossible to define. They were fluid yet structured, chaotic yet purposeful, and each step he took seemed to draw them closer, tightening the air with an almost tangible pressure. He felt the figure's presence again, closer now than ever, yet it remained elusive, partially obscured by the thickening shadows. It was patient, deliberate, observing him with an intensity that made his chest constrict. The hollow sockets of its eyes seemed to see beyond the surface, piercing straight through to the core of him, exposing every fear, every doubt, every hesitation he had carried to this point. And yet, beneath the terror, beneath the suffocating weight of the darkness, there was a strange, almost seductive compulsion to move forward, to confront it fully, to understand. He advanced slowly, each step calculated, forcing his shaking legs to cooperate. The air became heavier, each breath a battle against the suffocating pressure. The whispers had returned, closer now, threading through his mind directly rather than through the air. They were fragmented, abstract, yet he felt he could comprehend them if he focused hard enough. They spoke not in words but in emotion and intention. Fear, anticipation, warning, urging, judgment, they all wrapped around him, guiding him toward the center of the darkness where the figure waited. The walls narrowed subtly, pressing in, almost tactile, as if the space itself had decided to constrict around him. The floor beneath his feet shifted again, rippling faintly with every step, giving a disorienting sense of movement that made him stagger slightly. He steadied himself, heart hammering, and noticed something new. Faint markings etched into the walls, symbols he could not understand, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to pulse in time with the shadows. They radiated an energy that was both alien and deeply familiar, almost like the corridor was speaking a language older than words, older than memory. The figure advanced slowly as well, its movements deliberate, each step almost perfectly synchronized with the corridor's subtle shifts. Its presence pressed against him, a force that was simultaneously oppressive and magnetic. He could feel the pull, not physical but psychological, drawing him forward, forcing him to confront the impossible, to face what the corridor had been preparing him for all along. The whispers coalesced into a low, resonant hum, vibrating through his chest and bones. Every nerve in his body was alert, every sense heightened, every instinct screaming that he was on the precipice of something profound and terrifying. A sudden realization hit him. This was no longer a simple corridor, no longer a mere entity or test. This was a crucible, a convergence of fear, perception, and reality. Every hallucination, every shadow, every pulse and whisper had been shaping him, forcing him to confront not just an external presence, but his own psyche, his courage, his endurance, and his understanding of the impossible. The figure before him was a mirror, reflecting his deepest fears, yet also a guide, showing him what was required to move forward, to survive, to comprehend the truth hidden within the darkness. He forced his legs to move again, stepping forward deliberately. The corridor responded in real time, narrowing slightly, shadows stretching toward him, the air thickening, the pulse of the darkness intensifying. Shapes flickered at the edge of perception. Impossible forms, twisting geometries, half-seen figures that defied logic and physics. The figure's hollow eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking, patient, observing, waiting. And as he stepped closer, he felt something shift within himself, a resolve solidifying, a determination that transcended fear. He would face this. He had no choice but to move forward. The corridor reached its apex of pressure. The walls pulsed rhythmically, the floor shifted beneath him, the air grew so dense that each breath felt like inhaling water. The whispers converged into a nearly intelligible rhythm, not language but cadence, a heartbeat of the place itself. The figure remained poised, a silent sentinel at the center of the darkness, its presence both terrifying and magnetic. His hand trembled on the flashlight, but he forced it upward, illuminating the figure fully. Its form was more distinct now, grotesque, otherworldly, yet strikingly deliberate. He stepped forward, closer than ever, feeling the weight of the entity press against him, the corridor tightening, the shadows bending toward him. And in that single moment he understood the ultimate truth. The darkness, the figure, the corridor, they were inseparable, and he had become part of the test, part of the culmination, a participant in something that transcended comprehension. Fear, understanding, curiosity, and resolve converged inside him, shaping a confrontation that was inevitable, unavoidable, and absolute. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself, raising the flashlight fully, and stepped forward once more. The corridor seemed to shiver in response. Shadows recoiled, shapes swirled, whispers surged, and the figure remained, patient, deliberate, aware. In that precise instant he realized the final step had been taken. Not just through space but through perception, through fear, through the threshold of understanding itself. The entity was no longer merely ahead of him. It was a part of him. And he was ready to face the culmination of the corridor's challenge, the ultimate revelation that had been waiting for him from the moment he entered. The corridor seemed to exhale as he advanced, a slow, deliberate movement of air that pressed against his chest and forced him to focus on each step, each breath, each heartbeat. Shadows twisted and coiled around him, no longer merely following but interacting, shifting in ways that were deliberate and intelligent. The figure remained ahead, patient, unyielding, an almost magnetic presence that filled the space entirely, yet left room for him to navigate, to confront, to choose. The air itself vibrated, resonating with a pulse that matched his own heart, as if the entity had synchronized its rhythm to his, testing his endurance, his resolve, his capacity to confront what he had been avoiding his entire life. He could feel the culmination of everything, the terror of the unknown, the compulsion to move forward, the physical and psychological strain of the corridor, the whispers threading through his mind, all pressing together into a single, undeniable truth. He had reached the point of reckoning. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to peer into him, but not with malice. They observed with clarity, patience, and intent. It was not simply a predator waiting to strike. It was a mirror of his fears, a reflection of his perseverance, a judge of his courage. He realized that every step he had taken, every stumble, every hesitation, every shiver of fear had been necessary preparation for this moment, the apex of the corridor's design. He raised the flashlight fully, illuminating the figure as clearly as he could. The pale, almost translucent skin pulsed rhythmically, veins barely visible, twisting in subtle patterns that suggested intelligence and awareness. The jaw twitched slightly, a hint of motion that made his stomach knot, and the empty sockets of its eyes seemed to lock onto his, drawing him in. Despite the horror, despite the oppressive weight of the darkness, he felt an almost irresistible pull toward understanding. This was the culmination, the moment where comprehension and terror collided, and he could not turn away. The corridor around him shifted subtly, the walls narrowing and expanding, creating an illusion of movement that disoriented him, yet also guided him. Shadows stretched across the floor and ceiling, reaching toward him like tendrils, almost tactile in their pressure. He realized with dawning clarity that this was not merely an encounter with an external entity. This was a confrontation with himself. His fears, his doubts, his resilience, his very perception of reality. Every instinct screamed to flee, to retreat, to abandon this impossible challenge, yet something deeper within him, a core of determination, urged him forward. He took another careful step, feeling the floor shift underfoot, the air thickening, the whispers intensifying. They were no longer fragmented but coherent in rhythm, a cadence that resonated through his chest, through his mind, through his very being. He felt the weight of every past failure, every regret, every insecurity pressing against him, and in that crushing awareness he discovered a new resolve. The figure had not moved, yet its presence dominated the entire space, an inescapable force that demanded acknowledgement. He understood that the ultimate test was not physical. It was psychological, spiritual, a confrontation with the limits of perception, endurance, and understanding. He focused on the figure's eyes again, and for the first time he felt a connection, a recognition beyond fear. There was intelligence there, a consciousness that transcended the corridor, the shadows, even the impossible geometry of the space. It was a consciousness that understood him, that had measured him, that had guided him to this point, and now awaited his final decision. His breath came in ragged bursts, heart pounding violently, hands trembling around the flashlight, yet he felt a strange clarity emerge amidst the terror. Every step, every moment of doubt, every shiver of fear had brought him here. And now he understood that this confrontation was not about escape. It was about comprehension. He advanced slowly, deliberately, until he stood mere feet from the figure. The shadows seemed to bend away slightly, giving him space, yet pressing subtly on his back, a constant reminder of the tension, the stakes, the weight of the moment. He raised the flashlight fully, illuminating the figure completely. Every grotesque detail, every subtle twitch, every flicker of pulsing flesh was laid bare. He felt no relief, only awe, only an overwhelming recognition of the entity's dominance, its intelligence, its purpose. A whisper rose, threading through the chamber of his mind, a voice not spoken aloud but felt within, vibrating in resonance with his own thoughts and fears. Understand, it seemed to say. See clearly. Accept. The word, or rather the meaning, settled deep inside him. He understood that this was the culmination of everything, the journey through fear, through uncertainty, through the impossible. The corridor, the figure, the shadows, they had all been teaching him, testing him, preparing him for this final encounter. And now, at the apex, he had the choice: retreat into the comfort of ignorance or confront, comprehend, and endure the full truth. He took a deep breath, steadying his shaking body. The figure remained still, patient, an unyielding presence that radiated both power and understanding. The whispers harmonized into a low, pulsing cadence that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. He realized then that the entity was not merely a creature, not merely a force, but an extension of the corridor itself, a manifestation of the journey he had undergone, the fears he had faced, and the courage he had summoned. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his hand, not toward the figure in aggression or fear, but in acknowledgement. Every nerve in his body tensed, the shadows around him quivering, the whispers rising in a crescendo. The figure's head tilted slightly, and the air seemed to respond, pulsing and contracting, a final test of endurance and perception. He felt the corridor itself holding its breath, waiting for his next action. And in that single suspended moment he understood fully, the journey had not been about survival nor about conquering fear. It had been about understanding, acceptance, and the recognition of forces larger than himself, forces that intertwined with perception, courage, and the human mind. He had reached the culmination, the apex, the ultimate confrontation. And in facing it, he realized that the corridor, the shadows, and the figure were never truly separate. They were reflections, manifestations, and guides, leading him to a comprehension that transcended the limitations of his previous understanding. He exhaled, a long, deliberate release, and felt a calmness wash over him, a profound, almost reverential clarity amidst the lingering tension. The figure remained before him, patient and deliberate, yet the oppressive weight of fear had lifted slightly, replaced by understanding, insight, and the knowledge that he had endured the impossible and emerged transformed. The corridor had tested him, challenged him, and now, at the end of this journey, he understood the truth it had sought to reveal. Courage is measured not by the absence of fear, but by the willingness to confront it fully, and wisdom emerges not from ignorance, but from engagement with the unknown. He stepped through the threshold, leaving the oppressive corridor behind, and felt the weight lift from his chest. The shadows had receded, the figure vanished, yet their presence lingered in his mind, a reminder of the trials he had faced. Every whisper, every pulse of the darkness, had tested his courage and perception, pushing him to confront fear itself. Outside, light flooded in, sharp and clarifying, yet he knew the journey had changed him irreversibly. He realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it. Understanding was not certainty but engagement with the unknown. The corridor, the figure, and the shadows were not enemies. They were teachers, mirrors of his mind, shaping resilience and insight. He walked away transformed, carrying the echoes of the darkness within him, aware that the greatest challenges often lie not outside, but inside, waiting for those willing to confront them.